can go.
Hallo. Hallo und danke, dass ihr heute Abend gekommen seid. Und vielen Dank an das Latz und Beginner für eure Zeit und euren Raum. Mein Name ist Julia Beck und ich komme aus den USA. I'm still learning German, so ich werde jetzt auf Englisch sprechen. So thank you all for coming, and serious thanks to the Begina and to the Lats for organizing and hosting this event. I'm a citizen in the United States. I have worked in the past years on behalf of women and lesbians. I testified twice before the United States House of Congress. I spoke in London. I did a lot of stuff. But tonight, I want to make tonight a night for lesbians and lesbian feminism. And I want to share with you some of the history of American lesbian feminism, how it has developed over time, what the current situation looks like. I want to give some historical context as well, so we can better understand how lesbian feminism has been shaped by the wider culture. I will share my own observations and opinions, but I have to say, I'm not here to hurt anybody's feelings. I just want us to create a dialogue together, one that hopefully will continue after this event ends. So thank you all again for being here. This is being recorded right now, but our discussion later will not be recorded. Before we get into anything too specific, I want to bring attention to the word American. This word is not accurate for my purposes tonight. There are multiple Americas, and the history of lesbian feminism across all of the Americas is not all the same. Our histories are shaped by our languages and locations, our cultures and traditions, however patriarchal they may be. All of these things can be very different, but our shared experience of being lesbians is what unites us. We are women, we are female people, and no matter what race or class or other patriarchal division that might come between us. When I was preparing for this event, I realized that there are many things that I share in common with the lesbians of Berlin. Not only do we enjoy lesbian culture, lesbian films, lesbian clubs, lesbian music, lesbian sci-fi, but we also face similar tactics of lesbian erasure and colonization. We share a common challenge of maintaining our women-only boundaries. For example, in the States 50 years ago, you could drive across the continent and visit at least one lesbian bar in almost every major city. But today, there are just a few lesbian bars left. Julia Penelope wrote about this in the Journal of Lesbian Ethics, and Bonnie J. Morris also wrote about this in her book, The Disappearing L. Many of these places that were intentionally women-only were forced to close because they didn't get enough funding or because their woman-only policies were found to be discriminatory against men. Excuse me. It's just so unbelievable to me that this shit's going on. Anyway, it's difficult for women in the States to organize women-only events in public, and I have a theory about why. You see, when women come together in the same space, we start breathing the same air. We conspire, con meaning with, and spire meaning to breathe. But whatever joys or misfortunes or general ideas that we share, it doesn't matter. In the eyes of the patriarch, our conspiring together is a conspiracy. And I thank Falcon River for making that point very clear. In the eyes of the patriarch, women breathing together is a conspiracy against men. And so the patriarchs try very hard to keep women isolated from each other. Women benefit from the company of other women, but our woman-only boundaries are consistently questioned and challenged. Andrea Dworkin explains that women's boundaries are broken down through forced closeness to men, which makes punishment swift, easy, and sure. We are so deeply socialized to believe that heterosexuality, the institution of marriage, and the nuclear family are all good and normal things that women want and need, These things actually keep women away from each other. Female separation and isolation is the key to male dominance. Even the definition of woman is being challenged by men, because even the word woman cannot be woman only. Anything that is woman only is a threat to male supremacy. And so, if we think logically here, the biggest threat of all is lesbians. Lesbians are women who love women. Female homosexuals. It's not complicated, but the world around us is quite complex. And when we look at ourselves as a group in the wider context of compulsory heterosexuality, we can see that lesbianism is political. We center women in our lives and in our politics. By doing this, we disprove men's biggest lie. The lie they have used for centuries to make us compete against each other for male attention. This lie is patriarchal and it is global. The lie that women need men. Women do not need men at all, despite what the history books or gospel songs or close relatives might tell you. In reality, it is men who need women. And this is what Mary Daly calls a patriarchal reversal. Men project their inferiority onto women, and then they call us the disposable ones. Where would we be without women? All of the people watching this were born from a woman. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for one woman who grew me inside her own body for 9 whole months and then pushed me through her muscles and her bones so I could finally breathe with her. The way we use our breath to sing and to speak matters. It's unfortunate that we as women are trained to distrust one another, to believe patriarchal lies. We are led to believe that sexuality is inherent. I strongly believe that any woman can be a lesbian. I do not believe that any woman is born gay, because I do not believe that any woman is born straight. In some states, in the United States, there are laws to protect homosexual people against discrimination on the basis that we are born this way, that our sexuality is a natural and unchanging characteristic. But this ignores the very real pressures of compulsory heterosexuality that women and girls face every day of our lives. Women are brainwashed, to say the least, and in some places physically forced to have sexual relationships with men. In 46 out of 50 states, teenage girls can be married off to their 33-year-old rapists as long as the girl's parents or legal guardians give their consent. How can any girl or woman forced into this position of submission ever have the time or space to consider that perhaps she might be a lesbian? And if she already knows deep inside, then she has been denied the opportunity to live an authentic life, free of men, whether by a conscious choice or simply by sexual desire. It is my hope that we, as lesbian feminists, can stand up for our closeted sisters and welcome lesbians who come out later in life. There is no denying the fact that these women will have very different life experiences from lesbians who have been lesbians all their lives. And women who become political lesbians after exploring feminist theory also have different experiences. There is no one righteous way to be a lesbian except to be born a woman and to love women. What matters is that women make the conscious choice to become woman-identified. We need to encourage lesbianism. Women and girls need to know that they can be lesbians no matter what happened in their lives before. What matters is now, right now, this very moment. No other time exists except for right now, as Sonia Johnson would say. So, will you encourage lesbianism? Will you shout out from the rooftops? Lesbian is not a dirty word. It represents the power and the self-determination that can only be found among women who love women. The word lesbian is woman only. And that's why men have tried for a very long time to pollute this word with negative connotations. In reality, lesbians are regular people. In history, lesbians are the vanguard of the feminist revolution. Some of the greatest strides in the history of United States feminism were made by lesbians, and what a long way we have come. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the history, and I feel myself getting choked up. I cry almost every time I give a speech, so if I cry, just bear with me, okay? All right, so lesbianism is not new. And neither are the reactionary attempts by men to suppress it. Let's look back about 400 years ago. In the 17th century, so 1600s, Europeans were busy colonizing the lands that we now call the Americas. Men traveled by ship across the Atlantic Ocean to pillage the land and all the people who were already living there. They brought their guns, they brought their wives, and they tried to construct some kind of legal system to control everybody. In 1636, a law was proposed in the Massachusetts Bay Colony that said sex between two women was punishable by death. Why would men, now let's think about this, why would men prohibit women from having sex with each other if women were not already having sex with each other? In 1649, a few years after that, we have the first recorded instance in the 13 colonies of two women being punished for loving each other. In the Plymouth colony, Sarah White Norman and Mary Vincent Hammond were prosecuted for, quote, lewd behavior with each other upon a bed. These women were not executed, but instead they had to explain in detail to a courtroom full of men what exactly they had been doing with each other on that bed. How humiliating. Since then, the records are full of barbaric and inhumane tortures committed against women for the crime of loving each other. Another example is that in 1779, 3 years after the United States was officially a country, a federal law was proposed that would punish sodomy, or homosexual acts, by physical mutilation of the person's body. For gay men, it was castration, and for lesbians, it was cutting out the cartilage of the nose, which is the bendy, hard flesh here. It's also in the ears. This law was not passed, but men did figure out other ways, to harm lesbians outside of the law. For example, in the 1800s, men sent women away to live in mental institutions for a wide variety of reasons, and one of those reasons was whether or not a woman refused to have sex with men. So in the 1800s, despite this, women were becoming much bolder. Women, as members of a sex class, were getting real damn tired of all this patriarchal bullshit. There was extreme tension between the northern and southern states about whether or not slavery was okay. Women who were enslaved, as well as women who were married to men, had no legal status. This was very different from the way that native societies functioned. Women of the Haudenosaunee were respected by their people. They were leaders, and that's just the way it was. Some of the pioneers of the first wave, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Joslyn Gage, were greatly influenced by the women of the Haudenosaunee nations, which the English colonists called the Iroquois. These nations are the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora. These nations were matrifocal and matrilineal. Family ties were traced through the female line. The division of power between the sexes was nearly equal. Gage wrote that the women exercised controlling power in peace and in war. A lot of the early suffragettes met up with the Native women, and they shared stories about their own lives. And one thing that happened was a suffragette was sharing something, and the Native women just laughed in her face. They're like, "You let your men control you like that?" It was a totally different mindset. Women of the Haudenosaunee enjoyed a kind of liberty and respect that the suffragettes found inspiring. But the journey to suffrage for the right to vote was neither simple nor easy. In the early 1800s, about 1820, 1830, almost every man of European descent could vote, regardless of how much land he owned. But only those men could vote. Nobody else, not black men, and certainly no women at all. Women were not even welcome in the abolitionist movement, which was growing stronger in the 1830s. In 1839, the American Anti-Slavery Society finally welcomed women as members, but this outraged so many men in the organization that it split apart that year. Men simply did not want to listen to what women had to say. Women who were wealthy enough to travel, like Stanton and Gage, they started talking with each other about their lives, about the way men were treating them at home, as well as in the abolitionist movement. They shared what they learned from women of the Haudenosaunee nations. The women would host tea parties and book clubs, and the men thought they were just doing little lady things. But in reality, they were developing a consciousness of their own about the oppression they faced as women. Thousands upon thousands of women across the country joined associations and clubs and local groups. They held national conventions where they would meet and talk. Journalists would record the speeches and then publish them in national newsletters. But mostly these women met to share and build ideas. Remember, this was before the internet, before Twitter. And most people, the majority of women, were not literate. They couldn't read. The women were conspiring, they were breathing together, and it was a powerful thing. But it was clear that racism was not only prevalent in the South, it was also in the feminist movement. Gage wrote about the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in 1851, a gathering of women from all over, and all of a sudden, a tall black woman in a plain gray dress walked into the room with her head held high, and she took a seat in the very front row. And all over the place, people in the crowd were whispering, "Oh, what is she doing here?" They were using the N-word. This woman was Sojourner Truth. Oh, I'm getting teared up now. Yeah. This woman was Sojourner Truth. And finally, she's like, "Can I say something, please?" And she spoke up to all the people there. She demanded to be recognized as a woman, and she demanded to have the same civil rights as any man. The needs of black women, their rights to citizenship and suffrage, were sidelined by many suffragettes as a distraction. The whole country was divided on the topic of race. Southern states wanted to keep slavery alive. Northern states wanted to abolish it. In 1861, we had a civil war about it. Many enslaved black men were promised to be freed if only they fought in the war. 4 years later, the war ended, and in 1865, the 13th Amendment made slavery illegal, except as punishment for a crime. People who had been enslaved could now become citizens, theoretically, and in 1870, black men could vote thanks to the 15th Amendment. After all, if they were dying for the country, they should at least have a say in who runs it. But there was a huge backlash in the southern states against these new civil liberties. The South had been totally destroyed. And it wasn't just because of the war. Angry white people, mostly men, fueled by generations of racist entitlement, lashed out against their fellow men for daring to exercise their new civil liberties. Some states, like the state of Mississippi, they used literacy tests and poll taxes to prevent black men from exercising their right to vote. A literacy test was a list of questions, but the questions were riddles. So even if someone could read the words, it didn't matter what answer they wrote. It could all be tossed away because it was a riddle. What better way to suppress votes, really? And even though slavery was abolished in 1865, black men were systematically arrested for petty crimes, or for no crimes at all, in order for the state to maintain its economic system. Remember that clause in the 13th Amendment, except as punishment for a crime? This criminalization of black men and black women continues today with school-to-prison pipelines, egregious patterns of police brutality, and the general suppression of black and brown communities. Now, hold on. Why am I talking about United States history instead of lesbian feminist history? Well, let's be real. Nobody lives in a vacuum. No choice is made without influence. And we must know our history, or else we are doomed to repeat it. We need to talk about the racist formations of my country, because this is a foundation of our modern society. Racism and misogyny are the threads that weave together the tapestry of the United States of America. Every institution, every system, schools, banks, transportation, healthcare, has been molded by male supremacist and white supremacist intentions. So if we want to talk about what's happening today, we need to look at yesterday first. So, at the turn of the century, what were the lesbians doing? Well, a lot of them were campaigning for suffrage. Many women involved in the first wave shared deep and meaningful relationships with each other. Sometimes they wrote letters to each other or kept diaries, and sometimes their writings were very sexually explicit. For example, Alice Dunbar Nelson, a feminist organizer and public speaker, she wrote in her diary about the thriving lesbian subculture among black suffragists and club women in the early 20th century. Millions of people of African descent had begun to migrate north for more opportunities and a little less overtly violent racism. People moved north and west for a chance at a better life, usually going to big cities to find jobs or toward the wild, wild west to establish their own homestead. This is called the Great Migration, and it's a period of time from 1917 to 1970, where 6 million African Americans left the oppressive South. In the northern states, women also made deliberate movements to distance themselves from oppressive influence. Women who were not economically dependent on men, women who were wealthy, whose husbands had died, they often lived together in what is called a Boston marriage. These women could share an intimate, lifelong relationship that was socially acceptable as long as it was not explicitly sexual. These rich and often white women were usually old, and people considered them to be just good friends, despite the sexual relationships that many of these women actually shared. From a feminist point of view, we could say that these women practiced a kind of lesbian separatism, using their economic privilege to exercise female autonomy away from male influence. A lot of wealthy lesbians moved away from the United States to live somewhere else less puritanical. For example, in 1903, Gertrude Stein moved to Paris, and she hosted a popular salon, and she wrote a lot of stuff about a lot of lesbians. In the States, lesbianism was considered deviant and wrong, a serious threat to the family, church, and state. When the British writer Radcliffe Hall published The Well of Loneliness, New York City police confiscated almost 900 copies of the book and charged the publisher with the crime of selling an obscene publication. Accusations of lesbian impurity were used to discredit suffragists for wanting the right to vote. Anti-suffragists already viewed these women as abnormal, and they pointed to lesbian suffragists as evidence that the movement was deviant and wrong. And then we had the First World War. Men who had previously worked in factories were now busy overseas killing other men. So women took their jobs. We were at war, so somebody had to make the weapons, Women worked in factories, and some even joined the military. Women were challenging the belief that a woman's place is in the home by doing almost anything men had done. Women argued that since we, too, were dying for the country, then we should have a say in who runs it. Militant suffragists like Alice Paul protested the White House, which was considered an act of treason at the time. Finally, in 1920, 2 years after the First World War ended, women were granted the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. That's 100 years ago this year. Now, the 19th Amendment came 50 years after all men had the right to vote. There was still serious voter suppression, and it wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, another 45 years later, that the literacy tests and other kinds of Jim Crow laws were considered unconstitutional. That's a long time. Between this time of 1920 and 1965, a lot of stuff happened. We had the Roaring '20s, then a Great Depression, another World War, World War II, the first and second use of nuclear weapons in the history of the planet, then the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and then, boom, the second wave. A lot of stuff happened, and people's mindsets changed radically, not only because of technological advancements, but also from our development of communications with each other. The world had changed, and yet so many things stayed the same. For example, lesbians had to be very careful about when and where to express themselves. Women were still being sent away to mental institutions for the crime of being lesbians. Men and male allies used conversion therapy and corrective rape, along with lobotomies and super religious Christian indoctrination to make women submit to men again. In 1952, the American Psychiatric Association added homosexuality to the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Doctors and scientists tried to pathologize why women would ever love each other in the way they were supposed to love men. At this time, lesbian and gay bars were popping up all over the place, but the police would raid these places all the time. Gay men were usually arrested in the bars, but lesbians were harassed and accosted in the bars and on the streets. Everyone had to wear at least 3 articles of sex-specific clothing, or else they would be arrested for cross-dressing, which was illegal. Men were punished for wearing dresses, and women were punished for not wearing dresses. Some lesbians embraced these accoutrements of submission. Danke. So these accoutrements of submission were feminine things. They wore dresses and makeup and high heels. They were called femmes since they followed the patriarchal path of femininity, which is prescribed to all women from birth. Other lesbians, mostly working class women, rejected femininity and instead dared to wear men's clothes, suits and ties, leather shoes, pants. Women had been wearing pants to work in the factories since the First World War. Pants were functional, they were not fashionable, and they certainly were not feminine. Since womanhood and femininity were and still are oppressively linked together, these lesbians who rejected femininity were called butch. The word butch was the nickname of a male criminal in the Wild Wild West. It was slang for tough kid, and it also could have been an abbreviation of the word butcher. Butch lesbians were seen as aggressive because they refused to behave in submission to men. Since they rejected femininity, butch lesbians were understood by the wider society as wanting to be men. After all, only men are allowed to be non-feminine. Now, when we talk about femininity and masculinity, we're talking about the hierarchy of social expectations of women and men. To be a real man, you must dominate women. And to be a real woman, you must submit to men. But these behaviors of subjugation are simply a reflection of domination. Femininity is a male fantasy. Women learn to be feminine in order to please men, because women as a class are held hostage by men as a class. In her book, Loving to Survive, Dee Graham explains that men are a threat to women's survival. Physical, mental, emotional, you name it. So women submit to our captors. To lie, we learn to lie about how we really feel in order to protect ourselves from the very real consequences of a wounded male ego. In the late 50s and early 60s, women started talking about this. They were once again meeting with each other, conspiring together. They held consciousness-raising groups. They developed theories about the oppressions they faced as women, and then they took action. Women wrote books and magazines. Women built houses. Women started cafes and bookstores and shelters. The strong grassroots movement of feminism in the 60s and 70s nurtured a huge surge of feminist literature and organizations. Feminists built on the theories that women had produced in the first wave. They held conventions all around the country, just like the women in the first wave did. They criticized patriarchal concepts like the nuclear family, the institution of marriage, and especially heterosexuality. No one was immune from this analysis, not even lesbians. Butch femme dynamics were heavily criticized as a replication of heteronormativity, the oppressive power structure of domination and submission. There had to be another way for lesbians to share deep and meaningful relationships without relying on male supremacist methods of behavior and interaction. There had to be a way for lesbians to simply be lesbians without all of that sexist bullshit. Unfortunately, but not surprisingly, all this business of lesbians criticizing heterosexuality was seen as a threat. But this time, it wasn't just the patriarchs who felt threatened. It was also prominent leaders of the feminist movement. At this time, women were called lesbians as an insult, regardless of their sexuality, when they dared to act as if they were autonomous people. Fear of being labeled a lesbian was a powerful deterrent against the development of solidarity among women. Does this sound familiar? For example, Betty Friedan, the author of The Feminine Mystique, referred to lesbians as a lavender menace in 1969. She was afraid that lesbians would sidetrack the movement and prevent any serious political change. She valued political connections with men and didn't want people thinking that all feminists were man-haters like those lesbians. Friedan had founded the National Organization for Women, NOW, which intentionally attempted to distance itself from lesbian causes. In 1969, that very same year, NOW removed a lesbian organization, the Daughters of Bilitis, from a list of sponsors for the first Congress to Unite Women. The next year, at the second Congress to Unite Women, there was a big lesbian protest. At the opening of the event, the radical lesbians, led by Rita Mae Brown, barged into the room wearing t-shirts that said "Lavender Menace," all in capital letters. They protested the erasure of lesbians from mainstream media, mainstream feminism, and media too. They distributed copies of their manifesto, The Woman Identified Woman, to every woman there, and it's available online. And so, lesbians continued to make our needs known. Women left their husbands and boyfriends. They attended consciousness-raising groups, and they kept on with the bookstores and shelters, and they even had a music record label just for women. The second wave was on a roll. In 1971, lesbians in DC formed the Furies Collective, They taught women how to fix their homes and their cars so they wouldn't be dependent on men. They published the Furies paper from 72 to 73, and recently, 4 years ago, the House of the Furies became the first lesbian-related historic landmark in DC, and the first lesbian site on the National Register of Historic Places. So the house is still standing, and you can go visit it today. Well, maybe not in Corona times, but sometime later maybe. In 1974, a group of Black lesbian feminists founded the Combahee River Collective, or the CRC, in Boston, Massachusetts. The name commemorates the Combahee River Raid of 1863, led by Harriet Tubman. This action freed over 750 people from South Carolina, and it's the only military action in U.S. history that was planned and led by a woman. Women of the CRC were disillusioned with the second wave of feminism, as well as with the civil rights movement and the Black Panther movements. In order to define and clarify their politics, they wrote the Combahee River Collective Statement. Demita Frazier, Beverly Smith, and Barbara Smith were the primary authors, and they said, quote, "We believe that sexual politics under patriarchy is as pervasive in Black women's lives as are the politics of class and race. We also find it difficult to separate race from class from sex oppression, because in our lives they are most often experienced simultaneously," end quote. The CRC sponsored 7 Black feminist retreats between 1977 and 1980, which were attended by thousands of women. These intersections of race and class and sexuality mentioned in the CRC statement were further explored in 1981 with This Bridge Called My Back, writings by radical women of color. This anthology of prose and poetry was edited by Cherry Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa, and in it, women of color challenged white women's claims to solidarity based on sisterhood. Quote, "We want to express to all women, especially white middle-class women, the experiences which divide us as feminists," end quote. In the 1980s and 90s, the movement started losing steam. Not only were there racial divisions, but BDSM, bondage, dominance, sadomasochism, it was becoming popular in some lesbian circles, and huge numbers of gay men were dying from AIDS. Many lesbians took care of gay men during the AIDS crisis, since they were not treated well or treated at all in hospitals. A lot of lesbian time and effort was spent on gay men, instead of on the needs of lesbian or feminist communities. Despite all of this, in 1992, a new lesbian group was formed, called the Lesbian Avengers. They were a direct action group focused on issues vital to lesbian survival and visibility. They organized a Dyke March in Washington, D.C., 20,000 women marched on the street, and a dozen lesbians ate fire in front of the White House. Other Dyke marches followed across the country. In New York City, the New York Avengers pushed a bed down Fifth Avenue, declaring, "Lesbians lust for power." In San Francisco, the Avengers marched with 10,000 women. The Atlanta Avengers mobilized 2,000. Lesbians refused to be forgotten or erased. And this is a fight which we continue today. In recent years, lesbians in the States have seen great changes in women's communities, and some of these changes have not been so great. One big thing, very big thing, was the end of the Michigan Women's Music Festival in 2015. For 40 long years, women and lesbians from all over the world gathered and conspired together in the woods. In the last years of the festival, there was again a heavy BDSM influence, and some women even wanted to welcome men. Now these men, these special men, did not call themselves men, but instead they chose to adopt feminine names and feminine mannerisms and feminine clothing choices, while keeping alive their male socialization and male entitlement. Today, men of this kind, men who claim to be women, have incredible influence over every major institution of patriarchal society: the government, the schools, the mainstream media, in even the organizations that lesbians started 50 years ago. Now, in 1977, the National Center for Lesbian Rights, or the NCLR, was founded by Donna Hitchens. The NCLR focused on issues that lesbians encountered, such as child custody and adoption, access to public accommodations and employment. But in 2018, just 2 years ago, the NCLR published a statement that not only condemned lesbians in San Francisco, but also erased lesbians from our own history. What happened was a group of lesbians joined a march. Now, some backstory here. For a very long time, lesbians have been attacked and pushed aside from things that should center us. For example, the Dyke marches. So a group of lesbians got real sick and tired of that shit. They joined the San Francisco Dyke March. They carried signs and banners. They promoted lesbian politics. But they were met with violence by men and male allies at the goddamn Dyke March. The organizers of the march accused these lesbians of hating men, saying lesbians have no place at Pride events. And then the NCLR claimed that Pride was started by a man in the first place. This is just plain wrong. Everybody knows that Stormy DeLavier, a black lesbian and drag king in New York City, initiated the Stonewall Rebellion. In 1969, the New York City police had been raiding gay bars so heavily that homosexuals decided to fight back. According to people who were there that night, who are still alive today, it was Stormy who rallied the gays by shouting, "Why don't you guys do something?" But Stormy is consistently written out of the story. And unfortunately, it's the organizations founded by homosexuals that are doing most of the rewriting. Lesbians are not only written out of history, but we are threatened with rape and death for even acknowledging the fact that same-sex attraction and love between women is our reality. Lesbians in Baltimore were told that we would be hung by our necks just a few days before the violence in San Francisco. Lesbians face serious social and economic punishments for clearly stating our boundaries, for celebrating our culture and our history. I was kicked off of a government commission 2 years ago for centering women in my politics. Many women in the States have been fired from their jobs and banned from community centers for posting feminist statements online, or even for liking the wrong tweet. For example, this is a very recent example, lesbian feminist Carolyn Gage wrote a play called The Second Coming of Joan Arc, in which she wrote a play called The Second Coming of Joan of Arc, in which Joan meets with women today and unmasks the brutal misogyny behind male institutions. The play was set to run from the 1st to the 10th of October, last month. But the theater suddenly canceled all the shows and stopped all the rehearsals because they claimed Gage shared woman-centered opinions on her personal Facebook account. Oh no. Men and male allies are attempting to erase the very existence of lesbianism. Lesbians online and in real life are increasingly pressured to unlearn our genital preferences and accept men as sexual partners, or else these modern misogynists brand us as hateful bigots. This is exactly the same treatment that doctors and priests have used for centuries to force lesbians into submission to men. Christian fundamentalists are doing exactly the same thing. Despite the fact that we have a separation of church and state in the USA, the country is still ridiculously religious. Elected officials, especially right-wing politicians, use Christian scripture to justify their racism and misogyny. On top of that, we now have a new patriarchal ideology that's got a chokehold on the left. Today, lesbianism is seen as such an incredible threat to male supremacy that young girls who would likely grow up to be happy, healthy lesbians are now encouraged to reject their female reality in favor of a male identity. The severity of this new misogyny is in direct proportion to the advancements that women have made in the last 100 years. We need to look back at our history. If we read what women have written, if we reach out to each other, if we reach out to older women and listen to what they have to say, we might just learn something new. We might be able to bridge the gap between our generations and stand arm in arm to face this brave new world. Let's be honest. We wouldn't be facing such anti-lesbian and anti-feminist backlash now if it wasn't for the strength of the waves that came before us. Now, thank you very much for listening to what I had to say.